A very good afternoon. Thanks for coming to listen this very interesting conversation on political funding. How money's rising role is actually distorting the democracy and impacting many of us in different ways. When your governance fails, corruption rises, and institutions actually start failing. We often blame the politicians, for everything, but that a lot of things actually happen in the process, which is actually many people won't actually know ordinarily unless you actually get deeper into the dynamic of the process. You don't actually get to know why actually so much of corruption and so much of rent seeking and all kind of thing that you see about the scandal and big ticket sort of sensational scams. I think the mother of most of these actually issues is about political funding, because democracy has an inbuilt kind of a requirement that it needs a lot of money. You can't actually conduct election without spending a lot of in terms of advertising yourself in political communication, reaching out to voters, and to maintain a party workers, you have to pay them, you have to have all kind of expenses, and that cannot actually come just by getting simple donation from the people or through membership and other thing. Obviously you have to take it from somebody or other. So in that process, what happens is that you quite often see kind of quid pro quo happens. That if someone is giving you a substantial amount, he's obviously expecting something in return. So he's not doing any kind of philanthropy. The cases where even party has actually gone to the extent of sourcing money from the tainted and mafia sources, and we have huge evidence in this country, starting with the Santanam Commission in 1960s itself, which brought out the nexus of criminal politicians and bureaucratic mafia, how they actually collude and start impacting your entire democratic process. Then we had the famous Bohra committee report in the 90s, which created a lot of sensation in India about the deep nexus of the kind of the mafia, especially the mafia. Those who remember, even people like Dawood Ibrahim in Mumbai, they used to finance political parties, and some of those activities had a bearing on law and order and many other things. And in the recent times in India, we have actually seen sort of the last election. Those who have actually many of us, you must be actually tracking that this was actually written by whatever anecdotal evidence we got. This is the most expensive election anywhere in the world, to the tune of like 60,000 crores, almost 7.5 billion US dollars. So the last election in US had crossed around 6 billion. So we have passed that sort of and for a poor country like us. But then what you see is actually just tip of iceberg. That is probably 10% of, if you look at by conservative estimate, this would be around 10 to 15% of, the real costs that actually goes in the election, financing. In fact, probably 7 or 8 times more money has actually been spent to win elections. So on an average, if you look at, there are some scholars who have actually said that 40 to 50 crores spent on each constituency in terms of campaign. So for Lok Sabha, if you look at like 543 constituency we have, on each constituency you have on an average 40 to 50 crores have been spent, both all candidates put together. That's kind of money that we are playing. And if you have that kind of money we are playing actually in the elections, so obviously when any government that comes to power, you can't expect them to be angels, that they will be making policies and decisions, other thing which is totally for kind of evangelical or public interest. Obviously there will be compromises, other thing. But that's one part. The second part is actually which Professor JooCheong will elaborate from the Australian and Indian experience. But as a sort of Indian kind of analyst, I would say this sort of so much of money actually coming to the electoral process, what it is actually producing is actually there are a lot of actually negative consequences apart from corruption and misgovernance. One, that it acts as a sort of entry barrier for a lot of aspirant candidates who wants to come do public service through politics, or the smaller political parties. They simply have no means. They will be outspent by the major parties many ways. You can't simply make a proper campaign because our constituency size is so huge. For a Lok Sabha constituency, you just look, there is not a single constituency which is less than 1 million kind of population you are talking. So there you need minimum at least 2 to 3 crores actually to just make a proper sort of campaign. So in a sense, you are actually eliminated in the very fast, and a lot of people just simply give up. Actually, there is no point. This also happens with the political parties, especially if you look at ideology-based party or parties that are issue-based parties, like someone is fighting on green movement, or like in Germany you have green parties, or someone is taking up the climate change issues or fighting on urban issues like urban pollution and stuff like that. They don't stand a chance actually. Where do they get the kind of money there? Then the third thing is the worst thing is actually when you spend so much of money on the thing, this actually has a sort of major effect also within your party system, because party finances in India, we know, mostly actually controlled by the party chief, and mostly because they are family run parties. So it is like family actually controls the party. So it's almost all entire finance is centralized. So there what happens, quite often they would actually you have seen the example of Mayawati and others in Uttar Pradesh, like the tickets are given to the highest bidder, 3 crore, 4 crore you get, and you get the tickets. So there you are still not looking at people who are coming with kind of serious motive to do something for the country. So it's like basically purchased. And if those candidates actually win, you think what kind of lawmakers they are going to be, and would not they do actually think for promoting their own business or sort of interest. So I'm saying in many ways it actually impacts. And in India so far, what we have actually done to reduce the rising role of money, that we have actually have a provision in which we have put a upper cap on candidate spending. Like for Lok Sabha, we have 70 lakh is the maximum, and similar smaller amount for the legislative assembly. But this is actually just for only for the laws actually meant for the kind of rule book. But in terms of this is actually openly flouted by candidates and political parties. That is one thing. Election Commission has no means and this mechanism to even monitor that, because candidates submit actually after the election, they submit all the bills of expenditure of the thing, but that is hardly verified. But the worst is that actually that restriction is not imposed on the political party. So if the candidate is spending 70 lakh, the political party, there is no bar. So political party for that candidate can spend any amount. And then the third party also is allowed. I'm your friend or the thing. I can also spend any amount in terms of running bills or providing all kind of support. So in a sense, it has become actually a complete a cynical play of this thing. These rules actually makes no sense. And then the issue is also about realistic kind of cap. If you are putting a cap, think about that for a constituency of such where you have more than 1 million voters. If you put just 70 lakh, do you think that person has actually a chance to fight elections? And second, if you put such an arbitrary and unrealistic he'll obviously forcing these people to violate. So they will find some loophole or in some or other basically so that expenditures are actually much lower, because bill or other things can be easily manipulated. So I'm saying the system we have also created is also forcing people to follow corrupt means and unlawful means. So one is issue about regulation, the kind of legal provisions we have created. One, that is not really very comprehensive. It doesn't cover the political party and third parties. Second, it's unrealistic. And then the third worst is actually you don't have zero enforcement. If you make law and then there is no enforcement, where do you go actually? Ultimately, you end up in making a kind of mockery of your own system, and then people make fun of the and openly you have lawmakers and MPs, MLAs have said that I have spent 40 crores 60 crores. Some Andhra MP recently said that he spent 60 crores. He's an NRI, and he spent about, and he openly said. Then Election Commission issued him other thing. He said, no, sorry, I actually said out of jest and other thing. I never meant. So that is how people take how serious they take to the law. So I'm saying, in a sense, we are actually in serious trouble. And whatever government has initiated in last 5 years, I think it has not really addressed some of these issues. Like we have created a new platform called electoral bonds, and we have reduced the cash from 20,000 to 2,000, but that's not really going to resolve these issues. In fact, electoral bonds is now producing a different kind of dynamics where the donation, whatever in the public, almost 95% of that donation goes to the ruling party. So that's also is going to create another problem, because it's going to create such a huge inequality between one party and others. So others do not have a chance actually in terms of tapping those money. And then we don't also know the identity of the donors, because there is a sort of opacity in that this won't be disclosed. So if you don't know the identity, so your very fast principle of disclosure that fails actually. In political funding, the main thing we are fighting about is that we should know the identity of, let people donate, but we should know the identity of the donor. In America and in many other places, they allow corporate funding, they allow all other funding, but at least every penny will be accounted for, and the names, everything will be available, so that if you and me or anybody wants to know why somebody is donating such amount to a political party and connect whether there is any kind of quid pro quo, we'll be able to do if the information is available, but we don't have that. So in a sense, the political class has in many ways deliberately actually done it for their own interest, and on this all parties are actually to be blamed. It's not about the BJP or Congress. Even left parties have not also supported about the disclosure and information. When Chief Information Commission a few years ago said that political party need to disclose that, left parties were the first to oppose this. They said this is none of your business. So I'm saying our political culture, in many ways, the political value system is also so that they are quite reluctant to disclose it. So here actually this is where I felt like we have Professor Joo-Cheong. He's one of the established kind of a leading scholar on this topic. He has done extensive work on on Australia and several other countries, looking at aspects of regulation, how expenditure, this control, in fact this control idea is his. So he would actually enlighten us, because I just gave a background of what's happening in India. He can actually probably throw some ideas where we can actually, India can learn actually from India's experience. And if the political class do not want that, that doesn't mean that we will give up. We have to keep pushing by all means, by judiciary, by filing petition, or or bringing this issue to the representative. So in a sense, we would benefit. And I have already shared actually Professor JooCheong's background. He's currently with Melbourne University, and he heads the program on electoral regulatory research. He is also working very closely with electoral commissions in New South Wales, and he has also worked with the Independent Commission Against Corruption. And then his work is not only related to only these aspects of political funding. He has also done a lot of work on migration and issues related to it. So I would actually invite you to enlighten us, and let it be informal and free flowing. And any point, if you have any kind of this thing to raise, feel free. Yes. Over to you.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for making time. It is really a wonderful privilege to be here. Neerajan's been very kind, but very false in his introduction of me. I think he's given an impression of my level of knowledge that I can only aspire to. The title has actually suggested to Neerajan was actually what can be learned from overseas experience, but Neerajan put what India can learn from international experience, which I hope it can, but I suppose I should just say as a huge caveat is that I'm only dipping my toe in terms of the literature in terms of India. So I will seek to frame the discussion broadly, and I will draw upon the little that I know about money politics in India, and hopefully the hope is that there'll be some insights, but more importantly, what I hope to is that you learn from you. So Now, I think what Neerajan said about the level of spending in Indian elections, or the concern about level of spending of elections on the integrity of democracy generally in elections, it is perhaps no big consolation. India is not unique as an electoral democracy in experiences. We are all familiar with the difficulties and challenges in the United States elections, for example. If you like, the most well-known / notorious case. The country where I live, Australia, we just seen we had an election this year too, where we saw a mining magnate outspend both the major parties, Clive Palmer. I think it's important, and what I want to do in this presentation is firstly situate the problem in terms of what I understand, or what I see as underlying dynamics in really all electoral democracies that give rise to this problem. And then secondly, sort of map out what are the general problems that these dynamics give to. Then move to the question of solutions, yeah? So give a broad understanding of the regulatory menu of options that are available if you're thinking, going down the path of controlling election campaign spending, and then focus more specifically on a particular regulatory measure, which is a caps on election spending, which you have here in India, the Representation of People Act 1950, which is really imported from the 1918 Representation of People Act of the United Kingdom, right? So which was also had applied in Australia for some decades. And I'm going to focus on that, and I'm going to tackle two issues with that particular regulatory measure. One is an issue that came before the US Supreme Court in Buckley and Vallejo in the mid-70s, that whether having a cap on election campaign spending is necessarily incompatible with freedom of speech. I think that's a threshold issue that one has to grapple with. My short answer is no. And then move on to what I see as key design issues. If you don't go down the path of putting down caps on election spending, what are the key design issues you want to think about? And I hope that I'll look forward to a nice and enlightening. I'm hoping you enlighten me rather than I'm enlightening you, right? Okay. So it seems to me there are two broad dynamics that explain the problem of increases in election campaign spending, high levels of election campaign spending. One are electoral dynamics. And I think Neerajan has alluded to this already, yeah? So elections require money to function effectively. Campaigning requires money, and campaigning is essential. Elections are about campaigning and about communicating. Political parties as institutions, enduring institutions, not just as election campaign machines, also need money to function, yeah? So what you have with elections, in fact, are recurring arms races, yeah? Where parties would actually amass arms for each election period, discharge those arms, and then so the cycle goes on again, yes? And it's an arms race because elections are by nature competitive, yes? So if of course the deep logic of competition is that you try to amass as much competitive resources as you can, and more important resources than your competitor, yeah? So what you see is that if this goes unabated in terms of election campaign, is that every new record will be smashed by another new record, right? Because the drive is to actually get more and more, spend more and more. Secondly, it's the dynamics of capitalist economics. And it's really about the constant efforts by businesses to protect their wealth and income, and including for key businesses through influencing politics and through the laws and policies that apply to the commercial sector. And what you see here is easy prey. Why is it easy prey? The funding of political parties, while you know how many crores might be big money for political parties, is small change for a large multinational or for one of these company houses. It is small change, yeah? And the result, or when this risk is eventuates, was in fact well captured by Albert Einstein decades ago, yes? Under capitalism, what Einstein considered to be the predatory phase of human development, Einstein said, the members of legislative bodies are selected by political parties, largely financed or otherwise influenced by private capitalists who for all practical purpose separate the electorate from the legislature. So you've got the electoral dynamics, and I think the dynamics in terms of capitalists, how economics are organized as under capitalism. And the problems that these dynamics give rise to fall broadly into two categories. Yeah, corruption and unfairness. Yeah, and corruption is a concept of many meanings, and I'll come to the various meanings that I'll focus on. And why is that the case? How could spending actually be related to corruption, which deals with the inflow of money as opposed to the outflow of money? Well, simply because it's the demand for election campaign funds that's driving the supply. Yes? All right. And indeed, I'm not telling you anything novel. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. This link was made clear by the Indian Supreme Court in 1975 in the Kanwar-Lakupta case. Yeah, and this was a case involving the candidate spending limits under the Representation of People Act. And the court said there, to quote, "The objective of limiting expenditure is to eliminate as far as possible the influence of big money in the electoral process." Yeah, so they're talking about the spending limits under the Representation of People Act. If there were no limit expenditure, political parties would go all out for collecting contributions. And obviously, the largest contributions would be from the rich and affluent, who constitute but a fraction of the electorate. The pernicious influence of big money would then play a decisive role in controlling the democratic process in the country. This would inevitably lead to the worst form of political corruption, and that in its wake is bound to produce all other vices at various levels.
So relevant even now, 1975.
Again, I'm not telling you, I'm being enlightened by all this, right? Okay, but this is not something that is India specific or unique to India, right? This is something that you could actually use this and say every country faces this particular risk. Yeah. Now, what about how do we corruption? It's a strong term. Yes, it's a strong term, and I think the Australian High Court, which is actually the highest court in terms of Australia, in the case of McCloy, actually provided a useful discussion of three types of corruption that are pertinent in this area. Now, there's quid pro quo corruption, and we are familiar with this, okay, these concepts, and just referred to this. But importantly, and the court emphasized this, and it's important for me to emphasize, that corruption goes beyond quid pro quo, or goes beyond bribery and graft. Clientelism is a second form of corruption that the High Court emphasized. And how did it define clientelism? It said it arises from an office holder's dependence on the financial support of a wealthy patron to a degree that's apt to compromise the expectation, fundamental to represent democracy, that public power be exercised in the public interest. Now, this connects, when we think about Australia as with India, and we spoke about this 2 days ago in a workshop, this connects to the corporatization of political funding in both countries, yeah? Where this dependence on corporate money, and often it's actually corporate money from particular sectors, yeah? So in Australia, for example, it's not that all corporates give, it's the strong bias is for contributions from those in highly regulated sectors to actually give, yeah? Dependence on that particular, on corporate donors is a form of clientelism, or at least gives rise to a risk of clientelism. And here I'm going to quote for the second time a very eminent source, Dr. Niranjan Sahu, who said that business funding of politics has emerged as the single biggest challenge confronting Indian democracy today. Quid pro quo, clientelism. The third one, which in a way links to the second category of problems, unfairness, the High Court identifies war chest corruption. And they define it as a situation where the power of money itself poses a threat to the electoral process. Yeah? And you can understand it, this type of corruption, as a problem of unfairness. Yeah? Okay? And often it's said that these high levels of spending undermine a level playing field, yeah? Or fair contest. Well, one should start by acknowledging that clearly is no straightforward relationship between the rupees spent or the dollars spent and the number of votes that you receive. That is clear, right? Okay. How much you spend, the effectiveness depends on how you actually spend it, yeah, and various contextual factors. That is abundantly clear. But it is also abundantly clear that money is a significant competitive resource, yeah, okay. And you can see this, I can quote you Australian studies, but you can see this in India, right? Where studies which show that wealthier candidates have a stronger chance of winning than less wealthy candidates. Yeah? Now, all other things being equal. And indeed, when we think about fairness of elections, it's not just, we shouldn't just focus narrowly on votes. Votes are important, of course, but it's also about the agenda being debated in elections. Yeah? And that impact on money or high spending on the agenda can be much more subtle, more diffuse, but nevertheless real. And then Neerajan referred to this early on, access to candidacy, absolutely crucial, right? So if you have a situation where big money actually rules in terms of election campaigns, there's clearly a bias towards those who are wealthier, yeah? And it's not just about wealth, but also this can actually map on to other attributive criteria. For example, members of other marginalized groups, including women. This was made clear to us, I think, 2 days ago, right? That for in India, that for women to decide whether even to stand for office, and even when they stand for office, that access to financial resources was a key barrier. Yeah, and this in India, it seems to me, is exacerbated by the unequal flow of funds, which is mainly corporate money, right? The estimates I've seen is that, please correct me if I'm wrong, Niranjan, was that in the last election that 90% of corporate money went to the BJP, with the rest going to the other parties. Is that
90%, 93%?
Yeah. So this is a highly uneven field. And again, these things, unfairness, corruption, and the seriousness of these problems that Neerajan stressed, and is rightly stressed, in a way, we're not telling you anything particularly new, yeah? The seriousness of these problems, in fact, were recognized decades ago by the Bombay High Court in Tata Iron and Steel, where the court said, democracy will be vitiated if results were to be arrived not on their merits, but because money played a part in bringing about these decisions. And I think the last sentence is absolutely evocative and pertinent. The form and trappings of democracy may continue, but the spirit underlying democratic institutions would disappear. What then can we learn from international experiences in terms of controlling election campaign spending? Given these dynamics, given the problems of corruption and problems of unfairness it gives rise to. There are a whole range of regulatory options, but I think good way to conceptualize it is to think about regulatory goals. Yeah? You're trying to deal with election campaign spending. How can you do that? It seems to me there are 4 regulatory goals, and I'll go through the regulatory measures that come under these regulatory goals. You can choose to, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can, in fact, it'd be wise to pursue all of them at the same time. Reduce the cost of elections, yeah? Or you can reduce the funds available for campaigning. Or thirdly, you can assist in the cost of campaigning. And fourthly, you can restrict the amount that can be spent. Let me elaborate upon this. You could reduce the cost of elections. So for example, in the United Kingdom, you have a ban on political advertising. Yeah? So you basically say parties and candidates, you can't engage in political advertising. So that cannot be a spend. Bring down the cost of elections. Now, there are other measures too that perhaps are not so apparent, but is crucial. So compulsory voting in Australia, and I know it's controversial in this country whether this is a good idea or not, reduces the cost of campaigning. Because a lot of campaigning is, in a voluntary voting system, a lot of campaigning is actually directed to getting the vote out. But under compulsory voting, that is eliminated, yes? You could reduce the length of campaign periods, yeah? Okay, and then the idea being less money to be spent. Or you might deal with, and it's a difficult issue in this country, the culture of gift-giving, yeah? All right, which includes, from what I read, vote buying, yeah? Right. So if there's less of an expectation of candidates they will engage in gift-giving, then of course you reduce the cost of elections, yes? So those are strategies under the first goal. Now the second goal is reducing the funds available for campaigning. And here you're thinking about controls on the contribution side, yeah? So you have, for example, with the VD Center for Legal Policy, which has argued that the ban on corporate contributions that was introduced by Indira Gandhi in 1969, lifted by her son in 1985, is that 85? Yeah. Rajiv Gandhi, but in 1985, should be reinstituted, yes? Now, if you reduce the amount of funds available, then of course, then the spending also correspondingly reduces, yeah? What I would caution here is that you don't want to reduce it to the extent that parties have inadequate funds to engage in campaigning. Because if from the little I read, that one of the key lessons I think from the 1969 introduction of ban was that ban was introduced without compensating measures in terms of funds, yeah, for public funding, for example, which meant, and an argument has been made that basically entrenched, drove the link between the black money and the funding of political parties. Exactly, because parties still have to fund the money somehow, yes? Yeah. Reducing cost elections, reducing the funds available, you can assist the cost of campaigning. And here we come to the question about public funding, yeah? And you know better than I do, this has been debated for years, at least since the 1990 report of the Goswami Committee on Electoral Reforms, yeah? The point I will make is that public funding also already exists in this country, but in indirect form, yeah? Indirect form. Tax subsidies, yeah? You've got tax subsidies through exemption of political parties from income and wealth taxes if they file audited returns. You've got tax deductibility for individual and corporate contributions. You've got in-kind support for petrol, loudspeakers, so on and so forth. And then you've got provision of free time on state-owned broadcasters, yeah? What I would say and please correct me in the discussion, that the indirect public funding through the tax system, what I do wonder is about the extent of its fairness, yeah? If you go through the tax system, of course, then you benefit those who pay tax, obviously. And those who are wealthier and those who earn more are those who will be paying more tax, yeah? So whether this indirect form of public funding is actually a form of unfairness in itself, I wonder, yeah? Now, I strongly believe in properly designed public funding, but I must say, I believe it for reasons other than the goal of controlling election campaign expenses, yeah? I think there are good reasons for it in terms of leveling up, yeah? Increasing fairness. But I think the Australian experience at least has been, at least with unconditional public funding, that rather than reducing the level of public election campaign spending, it possibly inflates it. Now, why it does so is actually quite easy to understand. If you give unconditional public funding, it's an add-on. Yeah, you're still raising your public-private money, and then you're gonna pull money, bang, where you're gonna put your extra money, you're gonna pump it into the election campaign. This is what parties do. Yes. All right. So really, I'm in good company here with Niranjan, but also people like Kapil, Sridharan, and Vaishnav, who've really called for public funding to be as part of an integrated suite of reforms. Yeah, it's not a silver bullet, clearly, and it needs to be properly designed with proper conditions connected. And I think, Niranjan, you've made this point here about connecting it to this transparency and disclosure norms. Yeah, so that is with public funding. Now let me come to the last regulatory goal. So we got last regulatory is restricting the amount of election campaign spending. Now you can do that, for example, with the ban on political advertising I mentioned in the UK. What I want to focus on is a measure that already exists in this country, yeah? Caps on election campaign spending, yeah? I'd like to focus on it because it seems to me it's not so high in terms of the agenda of reforms, yeah? Which I think we had this conversation, puzzles me a little bit, yeah? Okay. What I'm going to do, as I mentioned in the introduction, yeah, I'm going to deal with the key design issues if you do go down that path, and I'll come to that. But I want to engage first with the question whether we should be actually ruling it out, because it is necessarily incompatible with any genuine belief in freedom of expression. Now, why is this a live issue? It's simply because this is one of the key holdings of US First Amendment jurisprudence, yeah? So we can trace back to the 1976 US Supreme Court decision in Buckley and Vallejo, which struck down, yeah, spending limits, which are part of a wider package for breaching the US First Amendment. And it said that spending limits were essentially necessarily, yeah, not maybe in breach, but necessarily in breach of the First Amendment. Now, what's important to understand about that conclusion is, of course, the line of reasoning leading up to it. And central to his conclusion was a rejection of political equality as a legitimate constitutional objective. So one of the more key sentences in Buckley and Vallejo was this, okay? And this is the part where they struck down the limits, and they said, the concept, to quote, the concept that government may restrict the speech of some elements of our society in order to enhance the relative voice of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment. Yeah? So the idea you can hold certain people back so that others can actually have a more meaningful voice, that is wholly foreign to the First Amendment. And of course, that is what caps and spending actually seek to do. Yes? Okay? And what you have here under the First Amendment is that freedom is understood also in a very particular way. That freedom is understood as freedom from state regulation. Yeah? Now, the reason for this is not hard to find. As the US Supreme Court, more recently in Citizens United, a case I'm sure all you are familiar with, emphasized, it emphasized in relation to the First Amendment that it was premised upon mistrust of governmental regulation. Yeah? So you have First Amendment that is hostile, that is, the premise is hostility to a state regulation. At the same time, that hostility to a state regulation is combined with being sanguine about the exercise of private power. Yeah? For two reasons, right? It's the dangers of state regulation I focus upon. And secondly, and you trace it back to Buckley and Vallejo, there's a sanctification of the use of money in politics as being democratic. And again, you'll be familiar with this, that idea that money actually is speech. Money is actually money, but it's been characterized as speech. And so every time you use money, you're engaging in speech. And therefore, if there is any limits on that actually impinge on your spending of money, there's an impingement of your freedom of speech and then a breach of First Amendment. Can you follow the reasoning here? Yeah? Yeah. Now, this approach was dubbed the libertarian model by the Canadian Supreme Court in Harper versus Canada. And there is very little doubt that the American approach is an exceptional approach and an outlier approach in Anglophone countries. Yeah? What prevails in other Anglophone countries, and what I mean by that is Australia, Canada, the UK, and New Zealand, is what the Canadian Supreme Court has dubbed the egalitarian model. Yeah? Now, in this model, the preeminent democratic value is political equality. Yeah? And political equality, too, has been recognized under international standards, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And it is a notion that we are all familiar with, that each member of the community has equal political status, and correspondingly, that wealth and resources should not determine the extent of the political influence. And Robert Dahl, arguably the key theorist of democracy, said this: if income, wealth, and economic position are political resources, and if they are distributed unequally, then how can citizens be political equals? And if citizens cannot be political equals, how is democracy to exist? And this connects with what Lord Bingham in the UK House of Lords decision in Animals Defenders International said. Yeah? And this is a decision, Animal Defenders International is a decision that upheld the continuing ban on political advertising that still applies in the United Kingdom. His Lordship said, it is highly desirable that the playing field of debate should be so far as practicable level. This is achieved where in public discussion, differing of views are expressed, contradicted, answered, and debated. It is not achieved if political parties can, in proportion to their resources, buy unlimited opportunities to advertise in the most effective media, and here's the key part, so that elections become little more than an auction. Under this model, egalitarian model, freedom is understood not simply just in terms of freedom from state regulation, but also in terms of freedom to, your actual ability to exercise your freedom. Yeah? Or as John Rawls puts it, it's not just the formal conferral of freedoms that matters, but also their fair value. Yeah? Let me suggest all this makes eminent sense. Yeah? We're all familiar that with the principle that elections not just be free, but free and fair. Yes? Yeah? And you know this better than I do because the Indian Supreme Court has in a number of cases characterized the free and fair election principle as a constitutional principle. Yeah? And when you accept that, contrary to the holdings of the US First Amendment, then you can see a clear place. Not just that the system permits caps on election campaign spending, but it might even call for some degree of controlling in terms of election campaigns. Now, having cleared the ground a bit, if you follow my argument that caps on election campaign spending are not necessarily in breach of freedom of expression, and you can see there might be strong policy reasons in terms of promoting fairness and preventing corruption, what then are some of the key design issues? Yeah? To my mind, there are 5. Yeah? Who should be covered by the caps? When should they apply? What spending should they apply to? What level should they be set? And how should they be enforced? Yeah? And I'll elaborate upon each of them right now. Who should be covered? And I think Nirajan's covered this early on, right? Clearly not just candidates, but also political parties. Yeah? So in a way, what needs to happen, let me humbly suggest, what has happened in India is what happened in the United Kingdom in 1998, where they had candidate spending limits under the Representation of People Act, as you have right now, and they basically had to move to a new statute, the Political Parties Election Referendums Act, and extended it to political parties. Because political parties were the biggest spenders, right? Yeah, makes sense. They didn't just extend it to political parties, they extended it to what are called third parties too, yeah? And third parties is a bit of a confusing term, but it refers to individuals and organizations that participate in election campaigns that are not parties and candidates. So what would be examples here? Trade unions in this country, yeah? Do companies directly? Companies too, yeah? So they are third parties, yeah? Why do you need to cover not just the contestants, but also the participants, yeah? This was explained very well by the Canadian Supreme Court, drawing upon what was the 1991 Lottie-Roy Commission report. Why do you need third-party spending limits? It prevents, for 3 reasons. It prevents the dominance of political discourse by the wealthy. Not just wealthy candidates of political parties, but also wealthy organizations. Secondly, it prevents parties and candidates from circumventing the limits that apply to them by creating front organizations. You can see the logic of that. If you apply to parties and candidates and political parties, but you basically allow them to set up organizations that are not standing for office, and that they're not covered by the spending limits, then this renders these caps meaningless. Yes? And thirdly, it reduces the risk of third-party spending having an unfair effect on the outcome of the election. Second question, when should they apply? Well, the short and simplistic answer is that during the election campaign period. Yes? Now, what that means really depends on the context, and I'll be interested to know what you think that might mean in the Indian context. But let me give you some examples from overseas experience about when there are caps on election campaign spending, and they vary actually in the length a lot. Okay, all right. So on the shortest period side, you can find the Canada Elections Act, which basically applies the caps from the issue of the writs for elections and ends on polling day. Yeah. And I understand that usually is about 1 month or so. Yeah. New South Wales, the most popular state in Victoria, in Australia, applies it generally for about 6 months, half a year. United Kingdom applies it for 1 whole year, 365 days. I mean, there's no magic in these numbers. It's, like I said, the principal approach is that during the election campaign period, of course, then there's this discussion whether the period is, the campaigning is becoming more of a permanent campaign, how long it goes on, and so on and so forth. And I gather in the context of India, where there might be stage elections too at particular points, is that right? So that will also influence how you apply the period. Yes. So yeah. The quick comment I'll make is that are there generally fixed terms in India? Fixed term elections?
Yeah.
They're all pretty much fixed terms. Yeah. Okay. Then that's no problem, because in Australia, at the federal level, there are no fixed term elections. Yeah. So the government actually has this quite really unreasonable advantage being able to call the election by advising the governor general, but you don't have the problem here, which is very good. Okay, third design question: what spending should it apply to? Yeah. Now, in principle, you will say the cap should apply to spending on election campaigning. Yeah. So this is broadly the approach taken in the UK. It's broadly the approach taken in New South Wales, where the Election Funding Act in Australia. But in practice, what people have argued was that if you cover all election campaign spending, it might give rise to problems of enforcement. Yeah? Okay? So some people have argued that, well, you folks should focus on not so much election spending per se, but on electoral advertising. The reasoning behind that is that advertising is by nature a public act. Yes? All right? So then it's easier to actually latch your regulatory hook onto that public act and then actually seek compliance. Now the disadvantage of that approach, of course, okay, so there's no straightforward answer here, is that it might miss very key items of expenditure. Yeah? So to draw an analogy, you've got under the Indian Representation of People Act, exemption of travel costs of leaders to campaign the constituencies. That would not be advertising, but might be a big cost. Or to make it even a more, give you a digital example, yes, okay? So you got this advent of micro-targeting, yeah, through social media and so on and so forth. Now, the ad at the end of it might actually not be very expensive. Yeah, in fact, people have said that, in fact, the ads are actually the lowest item cost, yeah? But the purchase of the data you made at the very on, okay? And then the data analytics are actually engaged in, right? To actually say, how am I going to fit this message to your particular preferences? Or you like the environment, or you don't like migration, and so on and so forth, okay? That is where the big money is being spent, yeah? So if you focus on the advertising, let's say advertising in a narrow sense, you're going to miss some key items, yes? Yeah.
The large portion of money in the last election has been actually spent on social media advertisement.
Yeah.
BJP almost spent 30 to 35% of its entirely on social media.
Yeah.
So also Congress.
Yeah. So weighing up these different approaches, right? I mean, in principle, cover everything, but you might say that's difficult in terms of compliance, but you focus advertising, that brings us its disadvantages. Now, one point I would stress is that, and it's a distinction that comes from the United States. It's a distinction between express advocacy and issue advocacy. Yeah, express advocacy is simply understood where you basically expressly advocate support or opposition for a particular candidate or party. Yeah, vote for BJP, don't vote for Congress, so on and so forth. Yes, issue advocacy might well be that I don't know what's a good example here. Okay, do more work for close down your fossil fuel industries. Yeah, and you don't expressly advocate them. Now, this for me is a distracting distinction. Some people have argued that only you should regulate a spend that's on express advocacy. Of course, you should regulate spend on express advocacy, but you know as well as I do that there is a lot of issue advocacy during election campaigns. Yeah. To give you a very simple Australian example, one of the biggest spends in Australian history is by the mining companies against a tax that was going to be levied upon them. These ads did not say, don't vote for the Labour Party, even though that was the hopeful effect, or vote for the Liberal Party. All they said was that, oppose the mining tax, don't destroy jobs. Yeah? Issue advocacy, but clearly not just intended to influence election campaign, did in fact influence election outcome. Now, at what level should they be set? And this is a challenging question, right? Okay, and I'm not going to give you numbers because that's great, but let's think of it as a level of principle, okay? How we can think about this, right? Okay, at the level of principle, and this was made clear, in fact, by the Australian High Court in a recent case, New South Wales 2, it should be high enough to allow political parties, candidates, and third parties to reasonably present their case. Now, big question what that means, right? But at least that gives us a starting point. Now, at the same time, it shouldn't be too high that allows the wealthy to dominate political discourse and elections. Now, we are in Goldilocks territory here, aren't we? Yes? Okay, not too hot, not too cold, not too high, not too low. Yes? Okay? And there are no magical answers here. But I think what I would stress is that the process is important. An independent process, a process that's independent of political parties, that actually sets what might be a level where they can reasonably present the case and yet not too high. So for instance, in Australia, and I'm not sure how this will play out in Indian context, is that I suggested there should be a Royal Commission process that sets these levels first, yeah, okay? And then if there's adjustment, it actually should be adjustment by the Electoral Commission through a scientific inquiry into what is reasonably required, yeah, rather than being set by Parliament itself, yeah. Let me add another principle. So this comes from the earlier point I made, that if you want to place caps on candidates and political parties, you need to apply them to third parties. Yes? Okay? My argument here would be that then the question becomes, how do you set different levels? Yes? Yeah? It seems to me that the third party spending limits should be set at a level lower than that which applies to political parties. Then you're thinking like, hold on a minute, isn't that stifling political participation? Why is that so? Let me hear you read. So, and the Canadian Supreme Court in Lippmann actually, so this Canadian Supreme Court jurisprudence is actually great in terms of understanding the reasons for this, okay? All right. So for two reasons. One is what this court said in Lippmann, saying that owing to their numbers, the impact of third-party spending on one of the candidates or political parties to the detriment of others would be disproportionate. Okay, so the idea being, and maybe this is different in Indian context, right? That you're going to have more participants than contestants. Yeah, and if the participants have both the same amount of autonomy to spend as the candidates and parties, then they will outgun the candidates and the parties. Yeah. The second reason, and this was recognized by one of our judges in the University of New South Wales case, is there's a functional distinction between political parties and third parties. Now, and what he says here applies more with parties that are seeking to govern. Yeah? Okay. So he says, during a period leading up to the election, a political party which aims to form government must be in a position to communicate on a whole range of issues of potential concern to voters. Yeah? So you need to present an agenda to govern the country, yes? Whereas a third-party campaigner is really on particular issues, yes? So the argument here being that parties, because of this functional distinction, and really by parties are seeking to govern, they need to spend more because you need to communicate more, yes? So, but third parties on the other hand will be communicating on just, let's say, do more for climate change or whatever, okay, on a particular issue. So their need to spend is less, therefore the caps should be lower for them. Does this make reasonable sense? Yeah, okay. Now let me just briefly wrap up the last issue and I'll conclude, right, okay? How should they be enforced? Now, that's a big issue, right, okay? Well, firstly, by independent, professional, and adequately resourced regulator. Yeah? And really, the electoral commissions are probably the most well-suited for that. But they need to be, of course, independent, which is one of the really tremendous feats of the Electoral Commission of India here. But they also need to be adequately resourced. Resourced both in terms of funding, but in terms of powers. So, which you have to issue, that you talked about, Niranjan. Yeah? There need to be effective penalties, and I think this is an issue here too, right? Now, effective doesn't mean really, really severe. You in fact want to have a range of penalties, yes? So under the Representation of People Act, there is a penalty, which is basically disqualification. Now, that's a nuclear option, right? That is a nuclear option, right? And of course, when faced with a nuclear option, regulators are rightly loath to press the button, yes? Yeah. So you need to give some intermediate options that they'll be more easily will take up. And let me just throw one example from Australia, from the Australian Capital Territory, where they are also spending caps. And this is where it hits the party's hip pocket, right? They say if you breach the spending limits by a certain amount, the penalty is double that amount. Yeah. Now, it seems to me something like that is an effective penalty because it's not the nuclear option, but it hits the hip pocket. And it's a very good deterrent, yeah, because it's double the amount.
Deterrence is.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And deterrence is not just about, I think you emphasize this, Niranjan, it's not just about what is available as a matter of the letter of law, but the willingness of the regulators to actually deploy those penalties. So you might have a nuclear option, but then they're loath to actually deploy it for good reason. Then people say like, well, and there's nothing else. Then they'll say, I think the point is they're kind of laughing, making jokes about, breaching this candidate spending limits, right? So let me conclude. I think I've emphasized regulating election campaigns spending at the end through caps. What I will emphasize is that you need to, in parallel, tackle two areas, yes? Two areas of campaign spending that are sometimes not recognized as a form of campaign spending. What are they? The first are the abuse of public resources for electioneering. Yeah. So we have Australia, and I think there are parallels to be here in India too. Government advertising used to promote the image of the governing party. Yeah. And that kind of advertising is not express advocacy, but usually takes the form of soft advertising. Yes. Okay. Massaging the opinions of the electors as to convey a positive image of the ruling party.
And that's 5-year affairs here.
Sorry?
Here it is actually government advertisement is almost 5 years affair.
Is that right? Yeah.
Each one compete actually, both the union
The state, yeah. Because I was noticing when, and maybe please correct me, I'm wrong. I was saying this commemoration of Rajiv Gandhi's death, and I couldn't help but notice some of the ads were run by the government of Rajasthan, the government of Chittagong, and so on and so forth. So I thought that maybe I'm wrong, but that seemed to me like a form of government advertising. Are they Congress? They're both Congress governments, right? So that's not a coincidence, yes? And Electoral Commission of India in 2004 recognized this as a problem. So you need to deal with that too, right? Because you don't be regulating the campaign spending of political parties and then still keeping intact an incumbency resource that could be deployed by the governing parties. Now the second one is a very challenging one, it's the question of the media. Yeah, all right? Which I suspect you could say it in India too.
Paid media,
And I'm paying me which, newspapers, television channels, radios, who can also be quite partisan both in their coverage and in terms of editorial. Yeah. So in Australia, we have a highly concentrated media market, where it's basically just two companies that actually own a whole range of TV, radio broadcasters. We've got a Rupert Murdoch problem. Yeah. Okay. Which were various mastheads under Rupert Murdoch, basically when have come up, very openly up against the Labour Party. Now that requires that's a separate discussion, but you need to deal with that too, because you're leaving that intact while regulating political parties or even regulating government advertising. I think still poses that risk to fair elections. Well, thank you again very much, and I hope my presentation was useful to you, and I really look forward to your comments and questions.
It is very I think quite a comprehensive overview of the challenges and different kind of levels of regulation and sort of initiative, and then a rich kind of insights that brought from the legal sort of a perspective from different countries, especially Canada and Australia. I think that actually gives us a lot of actually things, menu for action. In fact, issues that you raised, especially in terms of that things about the putting a cap and how this thing can be realistically enforced.
Yeah.
I think this is where actually we have to work, because in India we have actually made a lot of progress in terms of bringing out different kind of laws, all kind of regulation, other thing.
Yeah.
But problem is that quite often they are actually unrealistic. They are actually very patchy, not very comprehensive.
Yes.
And then the major actually area where we actually really lag is enforcement.
Yeah.
It's almost like zero enforcement, and this is not about only election spending and political sort of campaign finance and other thing. This actually cuts across in every segment of our system. You can actually draw the same sort of way in every sector of our governance, including the criminal justice system. You go one up to almost everywhere the same story. But this story is very important because this affects the democracy, the quality of democracy, quality of representation, and many things. I think you have raised many important points. So we have almost around 20-25 minutes for kind of question and comments. So I open the floor now. If you have any kind of comments or particular questions, please feel free. And this is very informal kind of way. So don't hesitate actually. Even if your question could be may not be completely directly related to the thing, but feel free. Just introduce yourself.
I'm Matthew Coombs. I'm a research intern here. I'm just interested in, I'm coming from a totally fresh eye to this. What is the biggest increase in spending going towards? Just that social media must be making it cheaper to post, it must be making it cheaper to get the message out there. So should we not be seeing sort of the cost of elections starting to plateau? Should we not see the costs going down naturally? Why? I get the two first dynamics that they've got this capitalism and this arms race, but should we not see a natural sort of decrease as it becomes cheaper just to put the message out on social media?
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Look, I no, let me speak more from Australian experience and generally, right? I mean, social media. Well, firstly, it's only one means of campaigning. Yeah. It does not displace other means of campaigning. It doesn't displace the air wall. With air wall, I mean like the TV, radio, ads. It doesn't displace, importantly, the ground wall, which is basically the door-to-door knocking and so on and so forth. The political campaigns will have to work, as with an integrated menu of options. So one is actually keep it in perspective what we mean by social media. And I think what the big unknown, and I think this is where I think really a lot of research, more research. I think the fake news debate has kind of, it's an important part of the discussion, but I think what is done because of that term, right, is that, and the UK Parliamentary Committee report on fake news and disinformation actually is really great, is that it's more than just disinformation or the use of social media, but the use of data. And this is what I was talking about. What we don't know is actually how much, even though the posting of the ad is cheap, the process leading up to it is actually not cheap. I know from Australia, people telling me this is not cheap, right? Okay, you were talking, to get, and you sort of think Cambridge and Analytica with, and it's all complicated because there were a group of companies helping the Trump campaign. They had about, I think, and please don't quote me on this, but it's something like 2,000 data points on each voter. Now, the ad comes at the end of that, all right? But the big issue is actually collecting all those data points and those the analytics that you run for it, and that costs the big money. So I think with digital, that's why I call it digital campaigning, right? I think we say use of social media, it focuses on endpoint. But I say called digital campaigning, the whole process, it might not be actually cheaper. And the other thing is that it's just another channel of campaigning here. And I still think that the competitive dynamic is such that you actually just want to spend more and more, right? Even if something's cheaper, you just do more of it, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone else? Political funding is a pressing issue in this country, and it doesn't actually revolt youngsters. That's a surprise. Yeah.
Actually, I have two questions, both unrelated. The first one is, so fundamental notion of democracy is there's a checks and balance between, say, the opposition and the ruling party. Why doesn't that take place when it comes to funding? Why do they try to outspend each other than to keep each other in check? So why do they keep going above and above each other than regulate each other and control the funding between the two? That is one. And the second one is specific to Australian context, where you said compulsory voting is there. So how was the change in funding after that happened, and was there a visible decrease in, or like a tangible decrease in funding after there's compulsory voting?
Yeah, that's a good link. I think with your first question, those two things that you're talking about are not incompatible, right? Okay, I mean, they're seeking to compete to oust their party, and that's why they're spending more to seek to compete to oust the other party. So it's in fact, they're part of the same dynamic, right? So I don't see this as the different alternation between the parties, and spending on competition is different. Look, the short answer with the impact of compulsory voting, and compulsory voting was introduced quite early on in the 20th century, is that I can't actually specifically answer your question, yeah? Simply because there's no data on how much parties spend, before and after compulsory voting. But it seems to me, in principle, at least you don't have to get the vote out. You don't have to persuade people that it's worthwhile to exercise their vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But then you have to spend to reach out, and to so that you are more competitive and your party's this thing is more appealing. Those communication, in any case you have to spend.
Yeah.
So here issue is not really because everyone is actually now it's assumed that all of them are going to come and go to get compulsory. So which automatically means that party did not have to spend more in terms of getting them to the booth. In India we do kind of mobilize them, have transport and all other things.
Yeah.
That's a different form of kind of mobilization. So there actually one can assume that one can think normatively that this might actually bring down the expenditure because what we do. But I think dynamics are totally different. That's quite an advanced country. And
So I'm not saying that you should. I'm not saying that. I think because we had this quite robust discussion about whether compulsory voting might be good in India. Okay, I understand. I'm not saying, but all I'm saying is that one advantage of it, and there are disadvantages, is that it reduces the cost of campaigning. That's all I'm saying. It's a very limited argument.
The presentation. It's just not a question, it's just things I wanted to know based on the international context. First of all, when we are saying that who should be covered, then we are saying that only political parties. So do we need to devise a strategy for the regional parties and the independent candidates who are participating in the election? Secondly, India does not have a one single election system. So there is a election to legislative assembly that are going on from time to time. And that also need to be covered in that political funding. Thirdly, in India, the variation depends on the demography of the states and population criteria, because some states are very small, some are big. So for each state, do we need to divide the independent agency, like how much spending for that state would be applicable? And lastly, when we are talking about the what level and we are deciding, we are just saying that it shouldn't be that high or shouldn't be that low. So where the regional, there are some states in the northeast where the regional parties are dominant. The main
regional parties,
the national parties are not in the scenario. The regional parties are dominant. Then where these regional parties will fix in this criteria, in this high, not very high or not very low. So these are some of the things that we need to ponder. And do we have any international reference where these can be handled?
Okay, very good questions. I suppose I should make clear. You should apply to candidates, political parties, and so third parties. And I said third parties is a misleading term because we're not talking about political parties. We're talking about organizations engaged in campaigning, like trade unions or companies. So it's not just political parties. Now, the problem you say with India is also a problem for Australia. It's a problem for any federal system. Yes? Okay, with different electoral systems. And of course, you need to have, if you got to have different kind of caps for the different electoral system in different states or at the federal level and the regional. There's no doubt about that. So there's not a one size fits all. And when you design the electoral system, and this comes to your next question, is of course this ties into how your electoral constituencies are actually drawn up and their composition. So one of the features of the Australian system, and it's a good feature, is that the boundaries are drawn. Well, our scale is much, it's a different size in terms of scale. But generally speaking, let's say, and this is I'm giving you a neat scenario in terms of Victoria, which is quite geographically is a smaller state, but the second most populous. So you don't have an issue about geographically big constituencies. And the constituencies are drawn that are basically roughly a comparable number of electors. So you basically have no big issue. You can, party candidate spend limits are basically uniform. Now, but then of course, if you come to a situation where basically, which I understand in India, where the number of electors vary considerably, you might move to and the geographical size also varies considerably, So the argument being that, of course, if you have bigger constituency of larger size, you need more money to travel and so on and so forth. You can do what the Canadians have done, okay? which is basically the spending cap. Okay, let me backtrack. Victoria or New South Wales, the way they do it is that they basically tie the level of the spending cap to the number of candidates you run. Yeah? But they're basically equal constituencies, if that makes sense. Yeah?
Just to add, in India we have actually, like, it's not a uniform kind of this thing.
Yeah.
For instance, for the Lok Sabha,
Yeah.
member of parliament,
Yeah.
the cap that is in upper limit is like 70 lakh.
Yeah.
But that doesn't apply to every constituency. There is sort of
Right,
it depends
okay.
on the region. Like you said, Northeast.
Yeah.
Northeast, the cap is actually lower.
Yeah.
Like 53 lakh or 60 lakh because the population size is smaller.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like in a state
Yeah.
like Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or
Yeah.
Tamil Nadu, the population is
Yeah.
larger in the
Yeah.
constituency.
Yeah.
So there the cap is actually has been raised.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that it allows them little more money to spend.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
election commission has in fact taken a lot of these cues from Canada and others.
Exactly.
By designing
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Issue is really about whether it's realistic or not.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then in terms
Yeah.
of enforcing.
Yeah, yeah, and I Mary John's basically what I would say. I mean, it's just the two criteria you can add to the design. It's basically you tie the level to the number of electors, or you tie it to somehow to geographical size. Yeah, okay. And again, I'm not going to tell you specifically what, but it's just in principle. That's what you'll be thinking about. Yeah, yeah.
So good evening, sir. Sir, India is called as the largest democracy in the world. So like when we use the term democracy, so the first thing which comes to our mind is like election. But as you have told that in election, the role of capitalism has been raised in such an extent that they are deciding the fate of the political parties. So sir, if you look at the case of US, there also we see the capitalists have been playing a very big role in India.
Yeah.
So in India, the same condition is being happening. So if you talk about democracy now, where the people get a chance to elect their leader through we follow the principle of representative democracy.
Yeah.
So can we can we say that it has just become a discourse, the term democracy?
Yeah, an excellent question. Excellent question, which gives me. You are right. A prevailing understanding to understand democracy as electoral democracies. Yeah, electoral democracies, and to be quite frank, I think that's a very warped and narrow understanding of what democracy is. Yeah, so we think, for example, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It does refer to elections, but the general principle, and it's a simple principle, but it's got profound implications. The will of the people shall be the basis of authority of government. And we should hold on to that. Elections, of course, a key part of that, but it requires much more than just elections. Yeah, and when we think about government, we shouldn't just restrict it into institutions of the state. Robert Dow, and it's one of those neglected texts, I don't know, Nirajan, what you think about it. It was also economic democracy. Yeah, and he made the point that basically at workplaces, that you basically have a system of government. And therefore, if you have a system of government, and in fact, this argument's been made recently by Elizabeth Anderson, who's talked about private government. Yeah, so we think about government. We so often think government is about the state, right? But talk about private government, basically. And you know that in India, as in Australia, as in any societies, when as a worker, and I work in labor law, so that's my other area, right? I mean, how do you understand what an employee is? Well, how you understand an employee is because the boss can boss you legally. The boss can tell you what to do, right? Okay. Now that is a system of government. And the argument will go, and I would make the argument, as Robert Dow will make the argument, that because it's a system of government, i.e. exercise of systematic power over a group of people by institution, yeah, it should be subject to democratic principles, that the will of the people shall be the basis authority of government. Yeah.
So my question is to both of you. Why is the role and space and also the appeal of left parties, socialist parties, decreasing in democracies, especially in India and Israel? And also, when it comes to funding, it's very difficult for them to actually get funds. So maybe you can both.
Yeah. In fact, I'll just jump before JooCheong says something. That's actually not only about India. This is actually quite a common phenomena all over the world. In fact, a lot of those left and socialist parties in Europe also are struggling, and many other parts in Asia, even in America also, you have some of those left-leaning smaller parties are struggling. That is one, of course. In principle, left parties all over the world, they say that they won't actually take money from the business, corporate. So because everywhere, if you look at actually, including India, I think a large chunk of the funding comes from business, the private interest, which actually fund for something in return. So that's one. But second thing is also the weakening of trade union and labor movement and all that, which you have witnessed, especially with the neoliberal kind of in the last 30 years, has also have a bearing in terms of their donation through informal and through membership and other small donation, other things also have dried out. They have also lost their base. In India, you can see in just 10 years, 12 or 13 years before left and now. At one point, they had actually 65 member of parliament. Today, they are actually in single digit. So you can actually see the drastic kind of a. So funding is also related to, in terms of their sort of appeal in terms of kind of to be in power, because see, a lot of time actually people also donate thinking that that party has a chance and it can come back to power and look at their interest or fight for their issues or the thing. If that is not the case, people gradually give up. And look at the case of Congress, which last couple of months back I actually compared between Congress and the Bharatiya Janata Party in terms of their fund kind of aggregation. If you look at Congress just was in power just less than 6 years. In 2013, 2012, Congress was actually on a pole position over BJP in terms of funding. But in just matter of couple of years, once BJP came to power, Congress has lost almost 70% of its funding. And today, if you are looking at today, Congress is actually in a dire situation. In fact, Congress doesn't get even 1/10 of BJP gets. That's largely also linked about the rise of BJP and its growing appeal and other thing in the mainstream, because people don't think that Congress can come back to power probably next 10 or 15 years, other thing. So it's also, funding is also linked. A lot of business also think, what's the point in putting money in a party that probably doesn't have a chance probably next election, other thing. So the money also surge actually happens during that day. If you look at, in fact, data which I have shown in my small article we published, when Narendra Modi became the candidate of BJP and he started rising, his profile started rising in 2013, late 2013 and 2014. In just matter of 6 months, BJP was able to get more donation than the Congress. Congress was still in power. So I'm saying a lot of people also think that now the Congress, because that time Congress was filled with corruption scandals, all kind of police paralysis, everything, and people thought he has a weak prime minister and other thing. So the business and other things started moving their money from Congress to BJP. So you could easily see the link. So that is where actually left parties, Socialist Party and a lot of parties with issue based kind of are actually struggling. And that's where we have been arguing that we should have a state funding, public funding, so that those parties also can sustain and put up a kind of decent campaign and hold on to their issues, because those issues also they fight for are also vital, like on labor rights issues, protecting those disadvantaged section of the things are very critical in a capitalist economy, because otherwise market forces won't actually correct those kind of inequities. You have to add anything?
Yeah, look, I'll just make some observations from the Australian context. One is that, it's clear that, the Australian Labor Party is the Social Democratic Party. The Liberal Party is usually in coalition, is on the right side of things, is that, the Australian Labor Party since the 80s actually taken on some key tenets of neoliberalism. Yeah, so they've actually moved right. So that's one part of the story. But I think the other part of the story, the contemporary story, is that Australian Labor Party is rooted in a tradition of laborism. Yes, okay, meaning it's for workers and so on and so forth. And this is reflected quite structurally there, where trade unions affiliate as members of the Labor Party. similar to the UK. Now, why do I stress that? Because I think it's given us real challenges in dealing with two sets of challenges that in fact are challenges for a lot of countries around the world. One is migration, the other is the climate emergency. Yeah. So with migration, you will see the tension within a social democratic party with trade unions, so that are you going to be open to migration or close to migration, right? And the trade, let's be honest, trade union movements across the world have often not taken progressive positions with migration, right? They've taken reactionary and sometimes xenophobic positions, but there's often also just split, right? Okay, so migration, and this is across the world. The other one is the climate emergency, right? Okay, so, and how do you transition, deal with the question about greenhouse gases? Now, of course, then you have to deal with industries, that fossil fuel industries, right? Okay, then of course, the unions who have got members. And in fact, one would say one of the decisive factors in the last election was basically that the right side of politics said that Labour was going to close down the coal industry. Okay, all right. Now, you had the union there was basically because they've got members who are going to be losing jobs, right? Okay, and how do you manage this? Yeah, you're going to see tensions, of course, even within the Social Democratic Party, right? How do you deal with the climate emergency? So, I would say those are the structural features, I think. Yeah.
I want to ask, the key to reform in Indian context, the key to reform lies with political parties, and they are enjoying the key to reform lies with political parties.
Yeah.
And at present, they are enjoying the loose laws.
Yes.
So how we are going to force them to change? Like you said that the much needed cap on political parties is much needed in India, but like the ruling parties, they are never going to change this because they are enjoying. So how we are going to force them to?
There's $1 billion question, isn't it? That everybody in this area try to be reformer. It's so much easier to talk about how you design laws, but it's the difficult things that how do you bring about the change, right? How to bring the where you've got this structural challenge, right? Where beneficiaries you have to basically persuade beneficiaries of the system to give up their benefits. Yes? Okay. Now, it's quite interesting. Very little is I suppose it's very difficult to write about, how these kind of things, because it's so contingent on particular context, right? Now, one is that there's one folk theory, and it's a folk theory, that you need some kind of corruption scandal, okay, to actually drive change, yeah? But of course, what you see is corruption depends on your political morality, yes? Okay, so for example, give an example in Australia where and the parties should engage in this, right? Where they basically say that you can pay thousands of dollars and I can sit next to the Prime Minister, yeah? I see it as a form of corruption, right? And more people are saying that. But when I use that word, people say, oh shit, what calling us? Because they thought quid pro quo, right? They thought like, okay, I'm giving you money for a planning decision. But as I think like, you're corrupting the process. Yeah, okay. So one folk theory is that. Now the other one is really that to tap into the self-interest of parties. I'm in Australia, maybe I'm not sure whether it's the same in India, I'm told constantly by the parliamentarians and crowd, they hate fundraising. Yeah, okay? They think like this is the worst thing they have to do, all right? So this is where the appeal of public funding is, okay? That you basically relieve them of this burdensome task, yeah? Okay, so you play this benefit. Now the other one is really, and here you see, that's what I was asking people in the past few days, the Labour Party, which got outspent, our Australian Labour Party got outspent in the last election, basically says, oh shit, we need to do something about this, okay? All right? And it's persuading the parties that fairness and self-interest can converge, yeah? Okay, I think that is the easier said than done, right? Okay, but that fairness and a virtuous form of self-interest, yeah? That says, okay, we don't want to be fundraising all the time, okay? We don't want to be kind of outspending, going through this thing and spending. And the thing is that I might outspend you this round, but then 2 campaigns down the line, you're going to outspend me, and then how's this? This is not a sustainable system. But that's a long-winded answer, and I'm sure not very persuasive. But it's the billion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar question. Yeah.
No, that's I think or what he raised actually is the centerpiece of India's I would say it's a kind of dilemma, and this is also something where actually the citizenry, the civil society has to actually do something, because all along actually whatever improvement we have actually brought in our electoral system in terms of transparency, disclosure, and bringing those information like criminal candidates, wealth of those candidates, how many crore-patis have become MPs, MLAs, all that actually have come in last 20 years after long battle actually, and through activist civil society actors like Association for Democratic Reforms, ADR, judiciary, taking a prime role actually. So this has actually taken a long struggle, and all through, if you look at actually, political parties have actually tried their best to resist to any kind of change or reforms. What is said is actually very correct. This is not only about India. This is all over the world. This is actually very common. There are some enlightened political leaders and political parties. Sometimes they do something for the future of the country and thinking about the society. But by and large, political parties have no interest to bring this kind of regulation. They think that can actually become something in their neck actually. Because look, you just look at the example of Right to Information Act. Congress, it was Congress, which was persuaded by a lot of activists like Aruna Roy and many others to pass that amendment in 2005. And what was the byproduct of that? Ultimately, that actually brought down Congress to the the corruption scandals, all that were revealed by RTI applications in 2009 and 10. All your Commonwealth scandal, coal block, including 2G, many things actually came through RTI application. This thing. So that actually alarmed Congress. Later on, in fact, Congress became so resistant to any kind of reforms in the second tenure of the UPA government, in which when the 2G other things scandal came, other thing to the public, they were completely unwilling to accept. In fact, some of them dismissed as zero loss and many things. People like Kapil Sibal, other thing. So in a sense, actually, after that, I think no political party is actually, even including the left, willing to bring those kind of reforms which they think can be a constant for their. And second thing is, as basically, if it's unregulated and there are no major kind of sort of penalty and other thing, it actually suits most of the political actors. And out of this political donation is actually lucrative area, because state is very powerful in India. It has administrative, regulatory arbitrage on many, this is environmental clearance, on many things. If you want to set up a company, you have to go through clearance and all that. So they use that actually to get the money. They are caught and percentage and other thing, and that actually benefits almost all the political parties, because they know if they're today in opposition, tomorrow it will be their turn. So that's the reason why they would not actually go for any kind of stricter other thing, and that is where actually it is reflected in you have almost 90% crore-pati candidate now in the across all political parties. So this is one way of amassing wealth, other thing, and run like a business. Politics has become more kind of business. So unless you actually we create in some way or other actually what he said about the structural, unless you bring a structural transformation in your economy as well as your regulatory environment, you are not going to see political parties or candidates showing interest. One, you have to really, the role of the state has to really reduce. That minimum government and maximum governance, what we heard during the Modi's first tenure, hasn't actually really happened. If that would have happened, you would have seen a lot of changes. State has no business to run business, but it is state running. State is now running most of your welfare schemes, mega schemes, one after another. What we saw during Congress time, BJP has out actually now. So when state has actually so much of you have a overbearing bureaucracy on everything, they'll poke their nose. If you want to run even a small company, other thing, that they have a sort of a interest and they want to see. So in that case, the nature of state, unless it is transformed, you will not see kind of incentive or any sort of a they will have. But what he said is also the game changer could be that you actually have to trap them, and then bring regulation. One way would be like the public funding, like because a lot of political parties, including Congress today, would feel they'll be happy if they have actually some funding available from the state, because they simply cannot raise that kind of money BJP is raising. They have no capacity, or they think that electoral also in a disadvantaged place. They don't run so many state governments on what they used to do earlier. So their revenue sources are drying off. So if there is a state funding, it would actually be advantage, and they would be the one who would actually bet on that. So this is where actually the citizen and others have to campaign and create a kind of provide them a sort of a this is the time that all these political parties, probably ruling party may not be interested, but all others should come together and make it a sort of issue, because this is where what he said, the self interest plus the interest can converse together. So I'm saying this is and then if you have state funding, the state is now funding 3,000 crores, 4,000 crores to Congress, other thing, and other parties. Initially, the problem will be regulation. They won't agree to the stricter, kind of enforcement and many penalties and all that. They will think that it should not. This will actually affect their rate. But over a period of time, we can actually do that actually through courts and justice system, because judiciary has brought a lot of actually regulatory kind of norms in the electoral system over several period of time, including criminal antecedent, disclosure of your wealth and other thing. All that have come through judicial dictate. So if you have a basis, if you have a kind of mechanism where people can go to the court and say that if these people are taking taxpayers' money for fighting election or other thing, they must be forced to also go through the regulation, and if they are violating or flouting other thing, they must be paid the way. So you create a basis for collective actions, and many other things can actually happen. So we have to actually think out of the box. Some way or other, you have to trap the political class. That is what I felt. Yeah.
Putting one solution-based approach on controlling election voting might be quite out of context completely. The thing is, Vishal this side, I'm pursuing a master's on my philosophy. So the thing is, like we are putting towards state funding, and what I say the problem in today's election campaign is only 10 to 20% people or families are enrolled. And
say the last thing we get, please.
10 to 20% people or families are enrolled in election campaigning or election process, like big business tycoons, and the QPO is rising just because only 10 to 20% people are enrolled in the process of election. How I will explain you.
Okay, yeah, sorry, please.
Like QPO happens because our population is too illiterate. They don't have capacity to fund to political parties, and that's why only big business tycoons or corporate firms are funding to the political parties. So that's why I'm saying only 10 to 20% families which have potential to give funds are enrolled in this process, and rest 80% of masses are not inculcated in the strata of our society.
Sure, yeah.
And
you're being funded people who are not voters too, right? Is that the other part of the point you're making? I mean, companies are not voters, right?
Now the thing is, why not to aware people about election fundings instead of state funding? There is a lot of again loopholes with the state funding itself. Why not people aware about the election funding and restricting the amount of election campaigning to bracketing the amount of election campaigning? Like just saying, putting a law in RPA or whatever it is, that bracketing the law that 70% must be come from this corporate houses and 30% from the entire population of India.
But question is enforcement. We have laws and other things. You are suggesting for another law, but question is who enforces? You have a cap, the spending cap.
There may be a loophole that they do some fake transactions and all, but the thing is, it inculcate our masses into the entire process.
No, I agree. I mean, you are talking about voter education and awareness of the thing. Sensitization is very important. In fact, main purpose of doing this exercise is also one way of sensitizing and also bringing this issue to the public. And many of you are actually important stakeholders. So which in fact in this country we are not debating more often. In fact, it should be debated across the universities, across colleges and other things. In fact, young minds should know what's happening and how electoral funding actually, a lot of it's like for election, it's like festival or other thing. But do they know the amount of money that is spent is actually, that is your money, my money, other thing, have channeled in different way and it has different effects altogether. So I'm saying those sort of awareness is very important, and if you have vigilant voters and citizenry, then your almost 70-80% of problems are solved. And unfortunately, it's not the case.
If I understood your question, comment properly, I think it's about how you bring about a balanced funding composition for the parties, right? That is not, I mean, not just corporate money, and what regulatory levers can you use for that purpose? What I should say is that private money itself is not inherently bad. Yeah, not inherently bad. I think why it's bad is when it's big money, okay, and then or it's money that is the composition of funding is such that it fosters dependence. Yeah, so it's not about trying to take away private, because I also think a situation where you got big money in small sums, yeah, that actually is a good thing. Yes, okay. Now, what regulatory measures might we have? Well, we might use public funding as, and this is where properly designed public funding, yeah, okay, and don't look at Australia, it doesn't got properly designed public funding, right? Okay, you might have matching funds. So you might say, well, okay, if somebody gives, I don't know, what's considered a small amount here? How many rupees we consider a small amount?
Small amount,
1,000 rupees, so that to a political party, yeah. Okay, then the state will actually match that amount. Yes?
yeah,
okay.
That's a small kind of donation.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, and you might use that to actually drive formalization too. Okay, you say you need to before you get your $1,000 of matching rupees in matching fund, we want to see that you got proper governance standards within your party. So you could use this to drive small donations, but also to drive basically better financial governance of the parties, right? Or you could use it basically, and I've argued for this in Australia, that you could have a certain amount of public funding that based on the number of members that a party has. And what's the point between the argument for that is to make parties more vibrant membership base, yeah? But again, you can use that to drive financial governance. You say, oh, okay, all right, before we actually really want to see that these numbers you've given us have got integrity, right? Okay, so show us the procedures you've got, okay?
It should be conditional.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Now, trying to bring it closer, because this we could have actually gone on, because it's such a initially I saw the response was little lukewarm other thing, but it picked up, and thanks JooCheong actually for taking time and enlightening us. And I think this issue is now actually going to resonate more often, because you are in India especially, we are witnessing such kind of asymmetry in terms of political funding, and then the kind of dilution that has taken place in last couple of years in terms of electoral funding laws, like your foreign funding laws have been diluted completely. Now any foreign company with kind of a 50% stake can actually fund. There is no restriction. The restriction over our all your 7.5 cap on corporate funding has been taken away, and then you have a new baby in the town, that is electoral bond scheme, where the donors need not have to reveal their identities, and any amount of money can actually be donated. So in a sense, actually we are now witnessing a new kind of phenomena. Unfortunately, whatever gains we had made in last 2 decades is almost now we are actually losing out that. So this is actually a kind of we are actually at an inflection point. I hope by debating, disseminating, and probably sensitizing some of our key stakeholders in our democracy would serve some at least purpose. And thanks so much for taking time and enlightening us about the international experience, and especially your kind of the example that you have cited from Australia, Canada, and other parts. I think is taken up very well, and we hope to actually make more kind of a documentation and work other thing, and probably we'll have also opportunity to collaborate on some of these things India and Australia and other countries together, especially the Asia Indo-Pacific kind of area, we need to do more. Let the political parties and let the governments actually be indifferent and do whatever they. But I think the citizens are not going to keep quiet, and we at our level, whichever way we can actually try and bring this to the public light, we will also do. And that's our political political speech.
Yeah.
We will fight to preserve our political speech and ensure that our voices are also heard. And thank you so much, and thank you everyone actually for taking your time and really participating with all the interest. We have a small token of this thing for you.
Thank you so much.
From water.
Thank you so much. Thank you.